The economy is growing. GDP is up. Corporate profits hit record highs. The stock market keeps climbing. Politicians and economists celebrate the recovery. But when you look at your own life, something doesn't add up. Your rent went up. Your grocery bill doubled. Your savings buy less. You're working the same hours, maybe more, but you feel poorer than you did 5 years ago. You're not imagining it. And here's why the numbers they show you don't match the reality you're living. What GDP actually measures: gross domestic product is the total value of all goods and services produced in a country. When GDP goes up, economists say the economy is growing and everyone celebrates. But GDP doesn't measure your prosperity, it measures activity, and there's a massive difference. If your rent goes from $2,000 to $3,000 per month, GDP goes up. The economy grew. But you're not richer, you're poorer. You're spending more to get the same apartment. If healthcare costs double, GDP goes up. If college tuition triples, GDP goes up. If you get into a car accident and spend $50,000 on repairs and medical bills, GDP goes up. More spending equals growth in GDP. Even if that spending makes you poorer, the inflation trick. GDP is measured in dollars. When the government prints money and prices rise, GDP goes up automatically, even if nothing actually grew. Let's say the economy produces 1 million widgets worth $10 each. That's 10 million in GDP. Next year, they produce the same 1 million widgets, but inflation pushed the price to $12. GDP is now 12 million. Did the economy grow? No. We made the same number of widgets, but GDP says we grew by 20%. That's nominal GDP growth. It's an illusion created by inflation. Even when they adjust for inflation to get real GDP, they use the government's inflation numbers. And as we've covered before, those numbers are manipulated to look lower than reality. So real GDP growth is overstated. The economy is growing slower than they claim, and your purchasing power is shrinking faster than they admit. Where the growth actually goes. Let's say the economy really does grow. More goods produced, more services delivered to genuine expansion. That growth has to go somewhere. And here's the secret. It's not going to you. Corporate profits. Corporate profits are at all-time highs as a percentage of GDP. Companies are capturing more of economic output than ever before. Stock buybacks, executive compensation, and dividends are exploding. Shareholders are getting richer, but shareholders are a tiny minority of Americans. The bottom 50% of Americans own almost no stocks. When corporate profits soar, they see nothing. Asset inflation. GDP measures production, not assets. When stocks double in value, GDP doesn't change. When house prices triple, GDP doesn't change. The wealthy own assets, stocks, real estate, businesses. When the Fed prints money, asset prices inflate. The rich get richer. But none of that shows up as GDP growth being distributed to regular people. You don't own assets. You own labor. And labor's share of economic output has been declining for 40 years. Government spending. A huge chunk of GDP growth is government spending. When the government borrows $2 trillion and spends it, GDP goes up by $2 trillion. But that's not sustainable growth. That's debt-financed consumption. And eventually, you pay for it through higher taxes or inflation. When GDP grows because the government spent borrowed money, you're not actually richer. You're poorer because the bill is coming. The productivity paradox. From 1950 to 1970, when productivity increased, wages increased with it. Workers captured the benefits of economic growth. Since 1980, productivity kept rising, but wages stagnated. We're producing more per hour worked, but workers aren't seeing the gains. Where did it go? To profits? To executives? To shareholders? The GDP grew, the economy expanded, but regular workers were cut out of the distribution. So, yes, the economy is growing, but you're not benefiting. The growth is going somewhere else. The cost of living deception. GDP measures output. It doesn't measure cost of living, and that's where the biggest deception lies. Housing. The median home price in 1980 was $64,000. The median household income was $21,000. A home cost 3 times annual income. Today, the median home price is $420,000. The median household income is $75,000. A home costs 5.6 times annual income. Housing became drastically less affordable. But GDP doesn't measure that. It just counts the total value of houses sold and calls it growth. Education. College tuition has increased 1,200% since 1980. It's risen 3 times faster than inflation. When students borrow more to pay for college, that's GDP growth. The education sector expanded, but those students are poorer because they're buried in debt. Healthcare. Healthcare spending is 18% of GDP. That's over $4 trillion per year. When healthcare costs rise, GDP rises. But you're not healthier. You're just paying more for the same treatments. The GDP grows while your disposable income shrinks. The debt factor? Since 2000, Total household debt has doubled. Student loans, credit cards, auto loans, mortgages. Americans owe $17 trillion. When you borrow to maintain your lifestyle, that borrowing shows up as spending. Spending shows up as GDP growth. The economy looks like it's growing, but you're just going deeper into debt to afford the same standard of living you used to have without borrowing. That's not growth. That's desperation, disguised as economic expansion. The quality decline. GDP counts quantity, not quality. When products get worse but cost the same, GDP doesn't capture it. Your phone costs $1,000 and breaks in 2 years instead of lasting 4. GDP counts the $1,000 sale, not the lost value. Your appliances are designed to fail. Your furniture is particle board instead of wood. Your clothes fall apart after a few washes. You're spending the same amount but getting less. The GDP stays the same. Your actual standard of living declines. Why they focus on GDP? Politicians and economists love GDP because it's easy to manipulate into looking positive. Print money, GDP goes up. Increase government spending, GDP goes up. Inflate asset prices, GDP goes up. They can point to GDP growth and claim success even while regular people are struggling. It's the perfect metric for declaring victory while the population gets poorer. What they should measure instead? If we actually wanted to measure prosperity, we'd look at different numbers. Median household income adjusted for real inflation, not the manipulated CPI inflation. Real cost increases for housing, healthcare, education, food. By that measure, most Americans are earning less than they did 20 years ago. Debt to income ratios. If people are going deeper into debt to maintain consumption, that's not prosperity. That's a crisis in slow motion. Household debt has never been higher. That's the opposite of economic health. Home ownership rates. Home ownership is declining, especially among young people. If the economy is growing but fewer people can afford homes, that's not success. Discretionary income. After paying for housing, healthcare, education, food, and transportation, how much is left? For most Americans, the answer is less than before. That's the real measure of prosperity. And by that measure, we're going backward. The bottom line. GDP is a measure of economic activity, not economic well-being. It counts spending, not prosperity. It measures output, not outcomes. When GDP goes up because prices rose, because people borrowed more, because government spent more, or because shareholders captured more profits, that's not your economy growing. That's their economy growing. You're not part of the GDP growth story. You're funding it through higher prices, more debt, and stagnant wages. The economy they measure is growing. The economy you live in is shrinking. And the gap between those two realities gets wider every year. So when they tell you GDP is rising and the economy is strong, remember, they're measuring activity that makes other people richer while you work harder for less. That's why GDP is rising. And that's why you're poorer. The numbers they celebrate and the life you're living are two completely different things. And until we measure what actually matters, the celebration will continue while regular people keep falling further behind.